Hello, and welcome to the Remembering and Re-Enchanting podcast. My name is Sarah Jolena Wolcott, and I am your hostess on this sacred learning journey of unraveling, unveiling, and becoming more fully alive at the end of the world as we know it. In this podcast, we offer up to you, dear listener, 3 forms of episodes to support your journey of remembering and re-enchanting. First, conversations with amazing people. Second, storytelling. And third, myth casting. In this episode, we're going to bring you a conversation between myself and another amazing, fascinating leader in the areas of remembering and re-enchanting. Hello, and welcome to the Remembering and Re-Enchanting podcast. I am just so delighted today to have with me the most wonderful woman who is becoming a friend, Maija West. Maija is an advisor, peacemaker, and former attorney. As a person of both Latvian and German heritage, raised in Maidu territory where the Sierras meet the Cascades, her vocation is to offer support for healing and reconciliation so that we can be in right relationship with our own lineage, with each other, and with Mother Earth. Towards that end, she co-founded the Healing and Reconciliation Institute, which we will probably be referring today as HRI, as well as maintains a private practice supporting forward-thinking organizations at the intersections of law, strategy, and creating teams and organizations that can enhance relationships. The Healing and Reconciliation Institute works towards a more resilient future by bridging indigenous and non-indigenous perspectives. We address historical and ongoing harms by, according to their website, they address historical and ongoing harms by facilitating a framework for repair. HRI puts particular emphasis on a concept they refer to as radical bridge building and primarily serves unrecognized tribes in California, the people of the Central California coast, and other regions in the Western United States. Maija, thank you so much for joining us today.
Sarah, it's such a pleasure to be here. Thank you so much for having me.
I keep learning from you and your colleagues at HRI, and I just, there's so many things I appreciate about the work you're doing, the work that you are doing, all of it, but also the kind of quiet, careful, and really gentle and purposeful way that you go about doing it.
I really appreciate that is felt, and I love the organization and how it's grown, and there's just a lot of beautiful, humble people who all have their own ways of coming into this work, and to see how that's reflected in that community has just been a source of great admiration and pride as it slowly starts to grow.
Yeah, I can feel that. I can feel that from the people I've met there, people around it, the way people talk about it. Like there's that kind of combination of humility and respect for each other and for the work itself. I remember when we were first talking, which was quite some time ago, I was completely fascinated with some of the work I've known you've been doing, not only within tribes, but between tribes and American communities. And like was really intrigued with some of the work that you've done with a retreat center located on the sacred site of an indigenous tribe. And you expressed a willingness and interest to kind of talk about that on this podcast for our listeners, which I think is very exciting. Before we get into that case study, which I hope we can actually like really kind of get into as a way of talking about a lot of bigger issues that are very much up for people across the United States and really across the world today. I think it would make a lot of sense to just start with, who are you? And also to start with, what is peacemaking? And those two things are going to kind of interweave together. throughout this conversation because, it all is all connected. And I want like maybe you want to start with who you are, maybe we want to start with where is peacemaking, and like a kind of a simple way of helping us enter the conversation that is really big. It's a really big conversation we're trying to have today. So just to start someplace simple.
Thank you. That's good for me. Even though I do some speaking, I always get a little nervous. And so it's always great to have some direction there. So thank you. I think of course, there's many ways that people will describe peacemaking, but from my perspective, um, peacemaking comes from our birthright with respect. And it's our birthright. Before we had these legal systems that I learned about in law school, we had a way of being together and a way of governing ourselves, a way of being in community. And that doesn't mean that there wasn't conflict, that we were all not sitting around doing kumbaya all the time, but we were governing ourselves in a different way than we do today. And that for me, as a female identified woman, the way I see that is also having to bump up against patriarchy, white supremacy, and colonization, and that I have to approach it from the perspective of almost doing things in a reverse order than I was taught by our society that we have here and growing up in California in what's now known as the United States. And so for me, that approach means I start with myself. Then I go to my family and my lineage, both my living relatives and those who've passed. And then I go to community. And I leave it to my family to let me know how I'm doing with those pieces. I always call my daughter my hypocrite detector, but we need those folks who can hold us accountable to our higher selves and commitments. And so for me, I have to think about all three of those aspects: myself, my family, and my community when I'm thinking about peacemaking. And so, that's really different than, an indigenous peacemaking process that comes from other cultural traditions that are not mine. But the way I think about it is from the way I have learned growing up and through my lineage, and how that shows up in the way I was modeled by my parents. So that's my current definition for myself. The organization has its own, but that's my own personal definition.
Mm. And just to help us understand, for those people who've not heard of this contrast before, um, how is that kind of going from the individual out? How is that different in other cultures as an understanding of peacemaking?
Well, I can't help but be influenced by my 15 years of being a lawyer and what we learned there. And I always said that I went to law school to learn the language of power, honestly, because I grew up poor and in a rural area that was completely neglected by California policies at the time. And so we just didn't get a lot of services up there. We didn't have professionals. We didn't have people with degrees, unless they were a teacher in the school. We didn't have really systems. And so, like, as I think about that from what it means to be, to have that individual perspective, I think when I went to law school, I learned something completely different than how I was raised. And how I was raised was we solve problems together because there just wasn't anybody to call, literally. And nobody could come in sometimes because we'd have these massive snowstorms and the roads would be shut down. And so you actually had to get along. And the town had 1,700, maybe has less people now, but when I was a kid, it was 1,700 people. So there was something about that created that. And so for me, I think a lot of people, I don't know how other people think of peacemaking, but I think sometimes if we think about it from a legal perspective, it's like there's a conflict and a third party is going to handle that for me. And that third party is a lawyer or an arbitrator or a mediator, or maybe now even a peacemaker. And again, there's a place for that because it's a different way. And they all have their place, honestly. I still think they're all can have their place where they land in terms of a third party support. And thank God for that. We do need to have third party support, but also let's not forget that we have the capacity to start that peacemaking work and take a responsibility for that in our individual interpersonal relationships. So for me, that's kind of the way I think about it, is that those are all gorgeous things. And I'm honored to get to be called upon to help resolve conflict, and I'm glad people call me, because we don't always have the tools. But as I approach it from a place of where I think it starts for me is like how to handle those interpersonal relationships, which also is really how do I reconcile those parts of myself so that I get in lineage there. And that's really how I came to this work, was my personal voyage of doing that.
Your personal voyage of like working with your own lineage and working with the dynamic parts of yourself and bringing those into harmony. Is that what you mean?
Yeah. And I would say there was I had kind of a spiritual crisis in my early 40s that really led me to this. My father had died, who had been a really important part of my life. My mother passed a few years ago as well. So I'm really kind of holding on to this matriarch role. But it really, in the beginning of that process, kind of starting in 2013. So it's been about 10 years now. I really, I had to go through some stuff. The first thing I had to really get through was really understanding the way my parents had socially conditioned me in a way that harmed my spirit, and that they were doing that from a place of doing the best they could. But that because of how I was raised, and particularly my mom, I really didn't want to really hear anything about what she was trying to teach me from a cultural perspective. She's Latvian immigrant, and we'll talk about that in a second, but I really just didn't want to hear what she had to say. And those tools she was trying to teach me, those cultural tools, and the ones my father was trying to teach me too, I just rejected all of it because I was so mad at them for, I don't know, not being as well as I wanted them to be when I was growing up. And so I had to kind of get over myself a little bit. And then, their before their passing and during their passing, that time, I had to pick up the pieces of what they were trying to teach me and really examine that. And that was for me reconciling my relationship with my mom, forgiving her, going through a process of releasing my relationship with her because she couldn't apologize for something she didn't understand, and to really let go of that. And with one of the most core relationships I've had in my life, that, sent me to that spiritual crisis that I was talking about, and then an awakening of my responsibility to move beyond my parents, to move beyond into my lineage, and to explore the multi-generational stories that had been passed down from one family to the next. And so my mom's side is Latvian. I'm very, very proud of that now. I'm wearing one of the necklaces today, and I always do, to give myself some strength and support and reminder. I'm also wearing a Latvian ring that's a braid, and those that have been displaced as part of the Latvian diaspora wear these rings to find each other because there's so few of us. So I bring those in today for visuals, to hope just, for those of you who are listening in, that I do those things to help myself remember because there's so few of us. But one of the things that I'm proud of the most about being Latvian, and this is a small country on the Baltic Sea, situated between Estonia to the north, Lithuania to the south, and edging on the Russian-Polish borders, that they were able to maintain their land-based practices, despite being occupied for over 800 years through both German and Russian occupations. The Latvians didn't get their permanent independence, and I'm knocking on wood here because of what's going on right now in political world, but they didn't get their independence until 1991, the fall of USSR. That was when I got to see my family for the first time, like imagine, I never got to see those folks. We couldn't see each other. But that lineage also included aggressively maintaining cultural practices despite the occupation. And so we're really known for our song and dance festivals and celebration of the solstice and equinox. And we have other celebrations that are similar, like to Dia de los Muertos, like Day of the Dead, and other ones that are a rich part of our current practices today. And so that's part of my recovery, was to reclaim my lineage on my mom's side, to bring my daughter back first when she was 14, to go back again with my husband last year to reclaim my citizenship, which I did for myself, my daughter, then my brother and my nieces as well. That's how important. So in the middle of that, I'm giving myself all these pats on the back, and I'm like, thank God I have this beautiful, gorgeous lineage that I get to recover, and that my mom was trying to teach me all along. And it's been so healing for me, because it gives me a set of tools and resources. The elements of culture turn out to be like what we need to have like wellness in our lives, from my perspective. And if we can recover the elements of culture and like look up the definition of culture and see like what ones are you missing? Because that's what I had to do. Literally look it up in the Oxford Dictionary. So those are the pieces that help support my spirit. And then that gave me some support so that I could pursue my father's side. My great grandfather was the Grand Dragon of the Ku Klux Klan in Colorado during the Reign of Terror in the 1920s. And so that's my next recovery of lineage and responsibility is now I have some resources and some support and ability to call upon those resources. But now those are the other aspects of my lineage that I am pursuing next. So kind of giving myself some time to really just bask in the glory of what I got to experience and continue to grow with the language and the regalia, the traditional wares, this, learning the songs and the dances, the foods, the community events, so that I have the resources necessary to face this other part of my lineage as well. And so, I come into today with those two pieces of my lineage, and both my parents being products of war also led me to this. So my mom being a displaced person, born in a displaced persons camp who fled World War II as a result of the occupation. Me being first generation born on that side, and then my father being a Vietnam vet who was completely abandoned by the military system when he returned. And that's what we handled growing up in that home. And so having both of those people largely formed by war and impacted by war, gave me a really first row seat. I got skills because of how I grew up as a child that many of you in listening might connect with. That, you can't gonna get a PhD in neuroscience, or you can just grow up in a house like that. So I was really thankful for those now that I'm in my late 40s and heading towards my 50th year. Like I feel very thankful for those skills and in the ways that I was able to heal so that I could be there for my daughter and husband now. And so for me, that's like what brought me to this work. And there's other pieces to the story for another day, but that's one of the big reasons why I came into this, was because I had to reckon my own lineage first.
Ooh, reckoning with our own lineages. I mean, I just so appreciate that. It's just been such a huge part of my life and my journey, and coming to learn the stories that we were not told growing up, and coming to see. For me, it's always been about coming to see my people from other people's from better understanding from other people's perspective. So not the story that I was told, but a little bit closer to the story that maybe other people told about my people.
Mm-hmm.
And to kind of get, not to tell their story, but to have a fuller interbeing understanding of my people and where we come from. And that's been immeasurably more helpful to enable me to relate to other people today, to myself, to different parts of myself, and to this land.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's good work, good and hard.
I hope so. Um, yeah, it's a learning journey for all of us. I would love to hear, like, so you were on kind of your own personal journey. What led you to to kind of co-found and collaborate in such a ways to enable the Healing and Reconciliation Institute to come about?
Um, I think there was a couple of truths that I had to accept as part of that healing process. One of them was that I did not want to align myself with the value system and the framework of dominant culture. Not only was it not in alignment with myself, but it was also causing me harm to continue to participate in that way of being. And I needed to systematically destroy that part of my professional life so that I could separate that part. And then, of course, the family piece continues. But on the work side, that was part of it. And around this time, it's like when it all came at once. So that was why it was a crisis, because it was like all aspects. But I had been asked to take on a sex trafficking case. involving an indigenous woman from Oaxaca. And that's all I can say here. But what I'll say is that was a 2-year effort. And in that process and time, I witnessed what I will call my white sisters, those of European descent who live, specifically in the area where I was at the time, forget that I was working on this case, nor ask any questions about the fact that this particular case represented hundreds, maybe even more, of lived experience of others that were residing in the region where I took this case on. And I was so angry about that. So I had to go through an understanding and forgive them for the fact that they couldn't remember, or I thought they didn't care. There's a lot going on, but I lost about 90% of my friends during that time. In this, more immediate friend group, I still have, I have friends, but it was a calling, honestly. It was a core value calling. And I needed to go through it because I'm not going to be friends with everyone. That's one thing that came out of it. I'm not here for everyone. I'm here for my own core values, and where there's alignment with others, that's it. And I don't care who you are. Like, if we're not there for that, and my colleague, Charlene Eigen Vasquez, brought me into the way of thinking about core values as being just this beautiful way of creating a threshold to relationship, but also and also helping elevate all of us. So we talk about what we want and how we want to walk in this world, then what we don't want. And that has been a really helpful gift. So through that process, I had also thought about running for office, which is kind of embarrassing to say, but there was a lot of other social change activist things that I had thought about. And I'd always been involved in social change activism from when I showed up in this world. The work of navigating the space in between institutions really appealed to me because I just had seen it all. I'd worked in almost all of them as a lawyer. And before that, as an activist and nonprofit worker and, community worker. So I really wanted to see what was in the space between. And there were other groups that were starting to do this work, but usually they were aligned with a church or a government institution. And so it was through some beautiful conversations with circles of women to start in the beginning, over a period of a few years, that led to there being enough interest to say, okay, yeah, this needs to come forward. And so, so it was formalized in 2018, but it was a result of that, about talking about with other people about what is missing from how we resolve conflicts together, and really a premise that trauma and the experience of trauma can be a bridge to us understanding each other. And now we know that's also intergenerational trauma. We know about epigenetics now, but at that time it was just this hunch that maybe since our brain responds to trauma in known ways, like fight, flight, freeze, appease, or fawn, then maybe there's a way for us to help understand each other if we can get really honest about our own experience. Then maybe we can be in community and be present and come from a place of compassion to other people's stories, no matter how hard they are to hear. Stories of trafficking, genocide, and other forms of impacts of colonization.
Mm. Mm. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Is there without going, I'm sure you have hours and hours you could talk about some of these things. But is there one or two things about the physiology, about how to kind of come a re-regulation, or any one or two pieces of that you found consistently helpful when working with people that you could share?
Sure. I'd say the first thing is just being aware of what our body feels like when it's activated and when it's not.
Mm.
So, we look to our body to tell us, because our brains actually don't help us in those situations. And there's books on that, but noticing in our body when we're uncomfortable, whether that's constricted chest, butterflies, a flushed face, constricted hands, a stiff neck. There's different ways our body tells us that we are not comfortable or safe. And so we look to that, we have to really trust ourselves, and our bodies actually are the best indicator of how we're doing from my experience. So that's one thing. And then the second is we always have available to us is we have oxygen. And our breath is a resource that's available to us at any time, wherever we're at, no matter how challenging. We have the access of breath. And I like to think of it as we're we're taking in the breath of the trees.
Mm.
And I think of the redwoods being here on the central coast of California and how powerful it is that when I can breathe in, I'm breathing in the breath of the redwood trees. And that is, of course, from a physiological and biopsychology, perspective, that actually helps our body know that it's okay and that it can start to release that. So those are the two things that I think of as like the lowest hanging fruit that's accessible to people. Is just, and they're both really, really important. And a lot of the work I do, we don't start until we have those two pieces,
Mm.
because those are really important tools for being able to stay present as a sharer or as a facilitator or a peacemaker.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Because boy, do we have to breathe when there's challenges.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
I have experienced that.
Mhm. No, every day.
Yeah. Yeah. And we get to breathe when there's not challenges too. So that's good.
Turns out, yeah. Yeah, and one of my colleagues is a pomologist, uh, Maria Elena. We did a presentation a couple years together, and her background was pomology, I think I might say it, but a lung expert. Anyway, someone that teaches people to breathe. And and she was also really involved in suicide prevention. And so she was just obsessed with the box breath. And so I always share that one. Now it's readily available online, but that's a 16-second breath. And that actually, a few of those is actually, very scientific also. So we got Western science and another way here, bridging both those perspectives. But I really appreciate that there's a value around that now as being such a good tool for us.
Mm. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And talking about the breath and the trees and thinking about our relationship to the more than human world kind of also is a wonderful bridge to think about, like, part of what peacemaking and coming into being able to create harmonious relationships between people, and the histories of colonization. That's very, very tied to what does it mean to create harmonious relationships with the land that we're on. And the land has its own histories, and its own struggles and its own, uh, ways of breathing and not breathing. And I'm just curious if, like, in general, like, how do you bring the land into your practices of thinking about and engaging in peacemaking?
I think it really, first of all, it really depends on who we're working with. So if we're working with a nation or more than one tribe, then we're always asking them how they want to go about it. And so we always defer there, like to what is needed, both from the protocols and practices, but also from the land itself. Like if they're on the lands or from the lands that we're practicing on, then they are have the highest level of expertise in that moment to share, what they think would be helpful for our circle or for whatever process we're going through, if it's formal or not. Of course, being outside is way better than being in a room. So just so we can access the natural elements and all those resources, whenever we can, or at least having open windows and, spaces where we can see outside. But as a practice, when those things aren't there, then I go to sharing some appreciation and gratitude to the land for being a teacher for us. The land, the land has a memory, and the land has knowledge that's much older than we humans. And I think if we have the opportunity to take some time to have a relationship with the land. One of my teachers said, treat the land like a therapist, which totally resonated for me because I've put some years under my belt in therapy. So that really related, and it's cheaper than therapy too. That's also what I believe he shared. But that capacity to take some time, I have always found to be really helpful. And, I hang out with some Santa Cruz hippie mamas too, or, I have a lot of different people in different walks of life. And, just putting some intention into bringing in the natural world through the use of, sometimes people will bring in items that represent the elements, like things like that can help. And it just helps remind everybody in the circle that there's something beyond our human form, that we could think about why we're there, and most of my work, all of my work really is related to being a guardian, a steward, or a protector of Mother Earth. And so, why am I doing any of this? Well, it's because I want to continue to be here as a human, and to have this relationship with the natural world. And I want it for my daughter and my grandchildren as well, So that's one way I think about it, is like the land is the elder, the ultimate elder. Mm-hmm. 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 Yeah. And so the Latvians have a lot of songs about nature for a reason. And then, land, then, songs of nature become metaphors for the human experience also. And so when we're paying enough attention, I think, we can learn so much from the natural world that help us create a different pace and tempo and values in our own life. And it's also can be used for political statements, and a lot of the songs of nature were also very political, but they're just cloaked in a conversation about willows blowing in the wind, but everybody knew what that meant.
Right. Yeah, so much of music is saying many things.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm. Can you share some about, so then, what does it mean to honor sacred land, right? Land, of course, all land is sacred. And that kind of leads the question about, what does it mean to honor sacred land? And I wonder if you can share some about the history of this, trying to keep a lot of confidentialities in this public conversation, but the history of a retreat center that was on, and still is, so far as I know, um, on sacred land. And like, what does it mean to approach land as sacred, and what are some of the different ways in which our culture is doing that today, and the conflicts that can ensue because of that?
Yeah. So I think what I'll just share is like, maybe because I grew up with these like Vietnam vet slash hippie slash Latvians in the Northern California, like I grew up loving to go hot springs and these beautiful places that are these, that feel sacred, these special trees, these sacred watersheds, I sought that out because my hometown was heavily logged. And so the special places were like, you had to really be strategic to go find them, and usually they were kind of like, couldn't be logged because there was a bunch of rocks, or it was too steep of a canyon, or it was inaccessible. And those places are all over, Turtle Island or the United States, which is, where I've always called home. But I have, what I really have recognized in my learning, through where I grew up in my new territory, but also through, working with nations, is that a lot of these sacred sites, if they're found and can be owned, they become spiritual centers or retreat centers, because of course people want to go there to get healed, and so these
Right.
sacred places are, everybody feels that they're sacred, and so everybody wants to be a part of it. And depending on the history of colonization, those lands often like landed in the hands of somebody who wanted to make money off of that. And so like all of that's just part of the story, right? But those are kind of the premium places now. But as I have been understood and taught, those are the places that folks went to get healing. And one tribal leader in my life, again, just protecting all the anonymity, but the folks who are listening in, for folks who are listening in, but those who have said these words know, thinking of it as like a hospital or clinic. And so if we think about these spiritual centers as being kind of hospitals or clinics, like in the way, like we might think about it in dominant culture, then we know that those are really important places because people need healing. And so I think one of the ways that I think it's important to acknowledge land is to know the history of the land you're on. And I do that because it's self-preservation, because if I don't know the land I'm on, when I go into a space as a facilitator or peacemaker, depending on how I'm being called, it doesn't matter to me. I don't really need the titles, but just however I'm being asked to come in that space. I need to know for my own understanding of not only what has happened on that land, because a lot of these places that were spiritual centers or places of healing are also the sites sources of trafficking and massacres, because they were I can't say it's for all, but the places where people were trying to protect something sacred, so if there was conflict, and depending on, again, on the history, they're all different, but in some cases that's the case. So if I need to know what happened on that land, and then of course knowing whose lands I'm on always, right? So meaning what territories of nations. Here in California we have many nations. We have more nations in California than we have anywhere in the United States, and I haven't ever been corrected on that, so I believe that's true. And yet, a lot of these nations had, overlapping territories and lands, because it's so resource rich. California is just such an abundance of resources, natural resources. So needing to know, who all is honored and can be called upon for expertise and to bring in for their guidance and support based on that land. And so spiritual centers in particular are, ones that, we do work with all kinds of folks, but, we've worked with mission parishioners, schools, all kinds of folks, but the spiritual ones, Buddhists. So we worked with different groups, but I always get nervous around spiritual centers because it's such a high responsibility that they have taken on. And some folks have like a governance structure that has a lot of integrity, and others don't. And that's for, the reasons we've talked about, the impacts of colonization, white supremacy, and patriarchy to the present day, all show up in how the organization or the retreat center governs itself. And that's something that, it's like my daughter being my hypocrite detector. Like we are either walking in our core values or we're not. And for me, at being a former lawyer, the governance structure tells me everything about where that organization's core values are. And so that's how I see it when I'm looking at it. I'm always trying to be really open-minded when we're called upon to be at any place that includes a sacred site. But that's an important consideration, is how are they holding that responsibility?
So let me just kind of say back to you what I heard you saying just there. Partly, there are these sacred sites, and all land is sacred, and there are these sacred sites, and that have been here in what is now the United States and what is now the western parts of the United States. Those places are places that people have been coming to and cultivating for millennia. Settlers, those coming with colonization, often recognized the sacred sites and tried to take them for their own. They would, and that might have led to huge conflicts, war and massive destruction of often usually indigenous peoples, and destruction of those sacred sites according to indigenous peoples' cultural values and practices that have been helping those sacred sites survive. And sometimes maybe a church is planted on that site, maybe it's just kind of becomes part of a larger, a retreat center. Right? There's lots of ways in which it can happen. There may not have been a building placed on top of a site, or it might be adjoining. But it's being the ownership, and with ownership, belonging and capacity for access changes. So it changes, it shifts to who has access and who is controlling what's happening there. And then because these institutions, whether that be the church or a monastery, and like it's not just churches that we're talking about here. It's a lot of different groups that are retreat centers. They are inherently bringing with them aspects of settler culture, dominant culture, colonial culture with them. And so that influences how they're governing the land and how they're governing who gets to come in and out, like accessibility, and what's happening where, and codes of conduct on that land, what's expected and what's accessible. And those, though, and that in doing so, they're enacting a set of values. And all of those values could be drastically different from what the indigenous communities may have had and how they might have treated the land. If they still have access, and often they don't have access anymore because it's often in some way gated or in some way like hard for people to access. Not all retreat centers. I've been to plenty of retreat centers which have a general open policy, except for the buildings, right? But the land is sometimes open and sometimes it's not. Depends on where you are. But in terms of like, so accessibility is a big one, but what's the governing culture of that retreat center? And what are the values of that retreat center? Not their stated values on their website, but the lived values of how they're actually doing their internal governing structure and the systems that they have put in place to enable that governing structure to function, and the governing structure, of course, is what impacts and influences so much of what's happening in any organization and how that organization engages with, in this case, particularly with indigenous peoples who have the historical understanding and deep connection to that land. Is that accurate?
Yeah, nailed it. Yeah, yeah. That was really helpful restating. And yeah, and like I of course I avoid some of the lines, so I appreciate you just pulling out some of the additional points there, because all of those, yes, 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 yes. And what I'll say is, what from my experience, it maybe is a timing thing, but just in the last few years, there's been a lot of pressure to do the right thing, and the right thing right now is to have a meaningful and good understanding of acknowledging, at least at minimum, the indigenous peoples whose land you're on. At best, you have a beautiful comprehensive strategy of co-management for the future or something like that, right? But what I have know from my background in practicing law, and then we see it in just human behavior, is it goes back to that stress response of fight, flight, freeze, and appease. So if we're coming from an appeasement place, or what some people call fawning, we have let's just say a really pissed off indigenous leader, rightfully so. And they have come in and said, I want you to provide X, I want you to provide this land. I want you to return the land, or whatever, something. But it's coming from that energy of saying, this is mine. This is my people's. This is rightfully ours. And so when that happens, a leader of, let's just say, a retreat center or someplace might, out of just sweetness, say, yes, of course, right? That's an appeasement strategy, because they haven't asked anybody yet. They haven't built any governance strategies or changed any of the culture inside the organization to actually meet that need in a meaningful way. That one person is trying to have trying to say yes, but they're activated already, because the indigenous leaders' anger is activating them, because their dad used to yell at them when they were a kid, and they haven't dealt with that yet. And they don't even know that they're activated, and they just forget. So that leader can walk away. They said yes to the indigenous leader, completely walk away. Maybe they disassociated, so they don't even remember what they said. So I think about it from that compassionate perspective. Also, I don't know if that indigenous leader has gone about their conversations and their governance structure to get agreement and buy-in by everybody, and they have a plan. So if there is a yes, they are able to meaningfully show up too and do something that is for the next generation, And so I don't always know that either. And so that it takes two to tango really is part of this. And that's the humanity of it, is that we have people with nervous systems that are unregulated, stressed out, for very different reasons, that are trying to do the right thing. And yet what happens is things can fall apart. And so when it comes to retreat centers that are on sacred sites in particular, that's just even more volatile, because we're talking about a really painful subject. We're talking about places where there might be burials sites. There might be, there's there's tools and resources and medicine that are on those sites that nobody else can even see or understand that that tribe needs to take care of their people. And they're dealing with an unconscious, disassociated appeaser who's saying, yeah, this is all going to be great. And it's not. It's not. And so one of the things that I really learned from this process so far is when I'm working with somebody, again, I'm speaking on my own personal practitioner level today, not the organization, but on a personal level, like I'm always thinking about what are the internal tools and resources available for someone to meaningfully get a consensus-based decision that includes all the diversity of perspectives so that the next many generations can continue that commitment as well on all sides.
Mm.
And that takes a lot to
Mm.
change, to say yes to that.
It takes a huge amount. I mean, even just starting the conversation takes a huge amount.
Mhm.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. And then if you have an organization that has maybe lapsed on their governance practices and they're not doing, what's considered best practices, even from like the nonprofit corporate laws of California, like even those basic ones, a lot of organizations don't follow because they don't think it's valuable. But for me, it's the most valuable thing. And a
Mm.
lot of organizations don't
So
follow.
what can you say just a little bit, like why is it that following the very Western model of of compliance, why is that so helpful for a nonprofit or a retreat center or a church? Why is that part so important in these larger conversations with people from non-Western and who are trying to, especially if everyone's, I mean, I'm not assuming that everyone's actually interested in decolonizing, but like when you're working with people from who are might not be coming from that background.
So the main reason is that it's a sacred contract with each other. And you're breaching that contract by not following those governance practices. And the main reason people don't is because they don't believe in them, but they don't know what else to put in its place.
Interesting. So so the governance practice creates like just the rules of engagement. How are we going to talk to each other and who's going to do what?
Yeah. And so
What? Right.
so bylaws are a good example of that.
So what?
Bylaws are a good example of that.
Bylaws, right, right. And if an organization hasn't collectively like thought about it very much or gone through a process of engaging with it themselves, then, or even if they have, like, then it becomes harder to have those engagements internally, much less between themselves and others.
So then you get a splintering, which is where people just go and do what they want to do anyway, because they don't want to get everyone's agreement because the agreements are too tedious or they don't reflect their current core values or moral compass. And so they just go back to that rugged individualism that causes so many problems.
Right, right.
Yeah. And it's totally understandable. I've been a part of organizations and the leadership roles where I really haven't been aligned with the bylaws. And I'm like, oh, I don't like this feeling, but my perspective is I have to follow them because I've made this commitment and it's my responsibility to be in the role. So if my role is treasurer or secretary or whatever my role is, I've got to stand in that integrity until I don't want to do it anymore and then find the next person to do it for me. Right. And I don't always do that well. Like I've not like always fulfilled those responsibilities, but that's the way I try to think about it. And the bylaws themselves, tell you a lot about whether, and how well they're followed, tell you a lot about whether the organization has the capacity to say yes. And that's whether that's a tribe or, tribal constitution, or if that's a nonprofit or a church or whatever. And so what we, when going back to that initial definition of peacemaking, like, if we're focused on community peacemaking, but we haven't done the family peacemaking, which for me is the organizational peacemaking, because we're afraid of having a hard conversation or advocating for ourselves, and we haven't done the individual peacemaking, but everything that we're doing is largely externalized, meaning we're in a relationship outside of our organization instead of inside of organization. We can't actually say yes or do anything for the long term because we haven't done these other pieces.
Mm-hmm.
And so, my responsibility, in this work for myself is to try to avoid causing additional harms based on colonization as much as I can, or at least minimizing them. And one of those is the broken treaties. And so we do that all the time today by making promises we can't keep. And so why can't we make those promises? Because we haven't done all this internal work to get everyone's buy-in and come up with a plan that will last for the next generation. And so it's really, it's something that like each person, is invited to support, but I see every person's role as being really important to that process. And I think people think sometimes like, who am I? Well, I'm like, well, it takes all of us, and if we don't feel like, whether we're within a tribe or whether we're within a nonprofit, if we don't feel like that organization or that tribe is walking in a way that has integrity, then we each can be peacemakers in that.
Mm.
We can each say something or get the resources necessary and advocate for those strong governance practices, because that I feel like helps us bridge between different cultural perspectives, different lineages, different class backgrounds, and it helps us find each other because we can go into those spaces and say, directly to look somebody in the eyes and say, I can do this and our organization can do this. And that's the hardest thing.
Right. And if you don't have those terms of agreement kind of figured out between you, you haven't really talked about them, you haven't really figured out what your fair process is, then
Mhm.
it can be really hard
Mhm.
to figure out how you're even going to talk to each other and who's going to talk to who and what's the yeah how you going to engage.
Mhm. And that's why I think having young people in part of every decision is so important, because like if you ask that, if that young person is there just to remind everyone, right? If they're not even talking, like I can as a facilitator, and be like, here's our young person. Let's think about their perspective on the future. What are we doing today that's
Mm.
going to either make that person proud or woefully disappointed in us as the adults in the room? And if that young person is invited to share, which I think is precious, like I mean, precious meaning not like condescendingly, but precious in like the precious resource. Their perspective on the future is really different than ours. And so we should be always making our decisions about what they understand, what they think the tools are. So like, are bylaws even written down, or are they in an app? I don't know. Are they a story? Are they a comic book? Like what is the future? What are they going to need that can like help them understand what the commitments we make today,
And
So
my memory is that part of how HRI structures itself is that you do have young people on your board and part of the organization. Is that accurate?
So shifting to HRI, a youth is on our wish list. So we started our new governance process 2 years ago, and so we are in the third iteration of that. And so the first one was to move to governance circles, and the second one was to move to the program circles, and now we're moving to our representation. And so yes, we have a seat for a youth advisor or youth board member, and we recommend that for everybody that we work with if it's culturally appropriate for them to do so.
That's beautiful. That's really beautiful. And when I'm just like, I'm curious, this is just out of curiosity. Are your bylaws things that are like publicly, can anyone look at them or and be inspired by them? Or do you kind of see them as more like sacred documents for yourself?
I mean, for us, they're pretty open source because we got them kind of open source. So the Sustainable Economies Law Center, I love giving them a shout out.
Yeah.
They're the ones that create the template. So that's publicly available. SELC is their acronym. And then those went on to one of our clients on the East Coast. And then we asked them if we could take them and build another set. But they have a template called a worker directed bylaws, nonprofit bylaws. So that's a great place for people to start. Like if they're looking for something that's more like kind of on the non-indigenous, like traditional kind of system, but with some beautiful flavor that comes out of the core values of that organization.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I'm just thinking about what does it mean to how do you support listening between groups when you can see that they're not hearing each other? But thinking particularly between indigenous and white,
Mhm.
either people, individuals, organizations, but I mean, it could be, I mean, this is much bigger than that particular, conversation, a
Mhm.
particular dyad.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I'll just say all humans, we do
Yeah.
under, so we'll just start there. So I like whatever client I'm working with and however they've grown up in the world and whatever cultures they're a part of, like we always focus on active listening. And I learned that as like a peer counselor. And like when I was like 14, it was like that's how long ago like active listening came into my life. But I'll say that that is also what a lot of therapists use in couples counseling. So one person speaks for 30 seconds, the other person repeats back exactly what they say, adds feeling, and checks for confirmation. It, that's peacemaking.
Mm.
So that's between two folks that are not activated
Mhm.
or slightly activated because they're not able to, get defensive and argue. They're having to listen and make sure they say accurately what the other person said. So that really does help with like creating some curiosity. And the curiosity comes from observing the person and how their emotions are showing up in their bodies and their tone of voice, and then speaking to that from a place of empathy. So that helps soften things. But when it comes to an organizational setting, my experience has been that most, especially here in California, because I came up in the public schools here in California also, did not learn about what actually happened as part of the mission era or the gold rush era or the establishment of national park era colonizations. There's many more in California in our schooling. And so we work with adults who've never ever heard about the genocide in California as it relates to indigenous people or the slavery of other people of color too, for that matter, of Chinese or the Japanese internment. Maybe some people remember that, people don't really know how Yosemite was founded and what happened to the original peoples at Yosemite. People don't know the other part of the story of Ishi, which is standard reading in the school system. So we have all these adults who come in just adorably innocent, thinking Californians are progressive, they're really open-minded, and we're just super good over here and we rest on our laurels. And then we hand them a dose of reality and they shut the shit down, they shut down. By the way, that's my first cuss word. I'm usually way more verbose, but I'm trying to keep it together. So I usually drop at least 5 F-bombs. So I'm really doing good here. But I'll just say they shut down, of course, because they're surprised. So that's the public school's responsibility, is to raise up the generations. That's their responsibility, is to make sure they're always, truth telling about what actually happening, truth in history. And that's what indigenous folks from the unrecognized nations that I work with here all say, truth in history. So if we
Mm.
have it then it sure as hell makes it easier for a culture worker to do their work now, right? For an indigenous person to have a relationship. And because that hasn't been done, and because racism exists and all the other things we've talked about, then folks can't listen for other reasons. So when as an organization, we make sure that people have a prerequisite in understanding the history of indigenous peoples, and that they have a real understanding of how colonization, patriarchy, and white supremacy have shown up in their own families. And can they look at that? Can they look at that? Can they take responsibility? Can they see how their privileges sometimes were literally based on the taking from others, either their people or their land? And that a lot of the abundance of resources came from pillaging other people and other lands and other natural resources. And that's really hard for people to want to hear,
Mhm.
especially if their ego or their way of thinking about themselves has been like being a good person. And so we have to kind of make sure that there's a sense of that, so that when an indigenous person takes the time to share how their project or their land return or their school policy or their church museum or their retreat center has affected them, that they are ready to hear that and they won't forget it. Because we're not going to ask that indigenous person to speak again, because that would be outside of, our integrity of our commitments that we've made to folks. And if that person wants to speak again, that's their business. But, we don't want that to happen more than once if possible, because it causes a lot of pain and it's hard. It's hard to say those things. And you don't want people to have to say something more than once, just like you wouldn't ask a kid who's reporting child abuse to have to say it more than one time. That's why. That's why we have safe rooms. That's why things get recorded, because we don't want to put anyone through that. So anyway, so yeah, so that's that's in a nutshell, that's kind of how we approach preparing people to listen, is we ask them, we're not here to assume what people know and don't know, but if they if it's new for them, then we ask that they do some type of decolonization work, cultural competency training, one of our HRI programs. It doesn't matter what it is, just that it gives them some sense so that they're ready when somebody says what happened to them in this neck of the woods as a result of their actions or the result of the actions of their predecessor, that they can hear that.
Right. They have the larger pattern. Right.
Mhm.
Yeah. As you know, like I, do so much work teaching adults, supporting adults in their own remembering journeys, which encompasses a lot of what you're talking about. And um and I find that like we create very supportive environments for people to go through that history. It's always something's always a shock. Because there's a lot of it, and there's a lot of pieces people don't always know they don't know. Um, and there's almost always moments of just feeling betrayed by their own culture and educational systems that they didn't get that to begin with, right? I'm sure you've seen that in your work as well. But then what I also find is that the there's like the ways of talking and listening between different cultures can be very, very different as well. And that can also be really challenging.
Completely. Yeah. And everyone's has a different perspective on that and a different need, like what was true for one person that I work with is not going to be true for the next.
Right.
And that's why listening is so important as a facilitator or peacemaker, is because it's like, I can't make assumptions. I can only say, Sarah, what do you need today? Not even what you needed yesterday, because it might have
Right.
changed. And so really honoring your humanity of how you're feeling that moment. Like, do you want to talk for 5 minutes? Do you not want to talk at all?
Mm-hmm.
Do you want to show up at all? You don't have to. I'm
Mm-hmm.
not, that's how we center healing. Like you are in charge of your own way of being in this space. And it's with 100% informed consent. And this won't happen if you're not there. If you're not there in a space that works for you.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm just thinking about the many like you're saying so much. It's like it sounds really good when you're saying it, but I'm hearing also just like I can only imagine how much work it took you to get there, to kind of be able to be clear about these things and to be understand what your own as you were saying, that values can also help us create needed boundaries.
Mhm.
And that we don't have a culture where our dominant culture, and this is true across a lot of cultures within the dominant culture, is not one where there's a lot of prior discussion about what are the ways in which we engage with each other.
Mhm. Mhm. Yeah, because and I have I have a soft place in my heart for that, because I would say, not everyone in every family wants to do this stuff. Just first of all, like I really respect the way my siblings or my cousins have explored these things in a different way, and we all have our different perspective. But for myself, um, in order to say I don't I don't think that what I was taught was helpful in this one way, or that more than one way, really is it can be a crisis of identity. Because who wants to, one of the people that I was talking to about this a few years ago, I think the way we described it is like, who wants to believe that their parents lied to them? Like, in the most benign and cute way. Like, I'm white facing, blondie over here, and like if my parents had, my parents didn't do this, but they could have been like, you're special because you're beautiful. And what we mean by beautiful is that you're blonde and white, And I could be like, oh my gosh, I'm special because I'm blonde and I'm white. You know what I mean? But that is actually what some people tell their kids. And so if you have lived your whole life with that archetype or that understanding of your identity, this type of work can feel like an identity crisis. And And so that like having support, you know, like the work that you do and the work that others do, like in community is critical because we don't want to put anyone through that type of crisis by themselves, right? And I was very lucky that I had a lot of people, indigenous and non-indigenous to Turtle Island, that scooped me up during that time where I lost my friends, you know, or so I thought, and I got new ones. And it was going through that created the greatest gift of creating, you know, and being in a community of support, where it was based on these core values and based on these new boundaries. Thank gosh, you know, because that really allowed for me to do that work even further than I would have had the courage to do by myself. And you know, and that's why this is community work. That's not why this is individual work, because not only do we need each other's support if we're going to confirm some of the truths that might lead to us abandoning a family institution, abandoning a work institution or a spiritual institution. If we let go of those, we need other community support to be able to have that courage. And we're not meant to do it in isolation. And also we get to learn from each other, because how have we learned any of this stuff? We've learned it from each other and from those honest conversations that allow us to just know that we're not alone. You know, we're not alone in this.
Mm-hmm. And I could see how for retreat centers, and kind of to take it out of the personal and family for a moment, like that the for a retreat center, and I'm saying this as someone who has worked at retreat centers and has a great like certain affinity and love of many retreat centers, um, that there's so much attachment to that land and to the way in which they perceive the land and to whatever their history is, whether it be 10 years or 100 years or a couple 100 years. And certainly with retreat centers, you have all of those different time frames might be possible. But the story of how they got the land, the story of how what the land has come to mean, the spiritual experiences that they've had there, their community has had there, the insights, the transformational experiences even that they might have had on that land. And then to feel like someone else has just a radically different relationship to it and a different sense of belonging and attachment and rights and access to it. I could see that being just very challenging, like challenging very core beliefs, not just about themselves as individuals, but also themselves as an organization, as a spiritual community, as a lineage in
Mm-hmm.
some cases.
Mm-hmm.
Uh,
Mm-hmm.
and I could see how many people would want to go into figure out what right relationships look like, and then having all sorts of challenges in figuring out how to have that conversation, because you eventually you run up against structures, social societal structures as well, not just individual capacities for conversations, but social structures around property and ownership and like what's safe and what's not safe.
Mm-hmm.
So I could
Yeah.
imagine those
Oh,
structures like really playing a role in making these conversations about sacred land really hard.
yeah, because, you know, if we follow this whole trajectory of like looking for our communities of belonging, like let's just say we have decided that our family's way of being didn't help us, and we find a spiritual community, or we seek out a retreat center and we build a new community of belonging. And we want that so bad, you know, don't we all want that? We want to be in the club, like we want to be in the club, like the right club, but we want, or maybe a club, like maybe don't care. Like my own, like, you know, standards were really low. I just wanted to be seen and heard and valued, you know. I just had a longing for that. And so like if I was in a community that felt like that for me, and I committed that to my lifetime or a decade of my life, and somebody came along with a different perspective, indigenous person, who said that way you're doing it is causing our nation harm, or you're causing the land harm, and challenging that, it would be really hard to hear. And so, yeah, there's a place for that. But what we all know, of course, is if we hang on to anything too tightly, it kind of loses its specialness anyway. And so, like that idea of being really inclusive and welcoming, so that we can hear different perspectives to keep what we do evergreen, while
Mm,
not violating the traditions of what we come from, like that balance between continuing to honor that change occurs and also maintaining tradition and protocol that support community, that balance, I think, is where there's some, opportunity. Because I think often we, from dominant culture perspective, we go in thinking when someone wants something that we lose something. But, like what I get to see is, oh my gosh, the richness. Like we don't know necessarily what it's going to be like, as holders of circles, facilitators, peacemakers, whatever we call ourselves. We don't always know what it's going to look like because we can't, because the circle is going to tell us. And in that circle is just this dynamic and rich group of people. And so the hardest part for me in this work is to get folks into that room together. And then once they're in the room, the magic happens, because we learn, if we're holding on too tightly to a community of belonging that, and maybe we get protective or defensive about it when someone says there's a different way. If we can hear what that different way is and welcome that different perspective of that land, of our community, or maybe even our practices, if we can welcome that in, then we can learn something that we didn't know before. And we can decide at the end of the day, oh, that doesn't work for me, or yes, it does. But what's the risk in asking? It's not like when we have these circles that everyone's like promising that everyone that says what their needs are in that circle is going to get their needs met. No, the circle has to decide what needs are being met. But why not say it? And why not hear it? So for the person who needs to share their vision, like, why not say that? And for the person listening, why not hear a different perspective? What's the worst thing that could happen?
Yeah, I mean, like but what's interesting is that as you're saying that, I think like if one can be in a place of security, or if one can be in a place of like a regulated system while those conversations are happening, and then can feel like, oh, maybe that idea that I've never thought of before could really work. Like I know that for myself, um, I have so much openness to so many possibilities when I'm not flipping out.
Mm-hmm.
Like, so, and that takes us back to like, what does it mean to create the conditions of safety from which radically new conversations and possibilities can emerge?
Mm-hmm.
And those conditions, and like, so it's part of why that, like, part of why I'm really like more and more appreciating the more I listen and think about it, appreciating like the way in which you're inculturating practices of personal biological re-regulation, as well as the structures that enable those conversations to happen, as you say, from a place of consent and safety. Because
Mm-hmm.
I think like so often, at least things I have experienced, is like people want to be having kind of cool conversations with each other, but then they don't know how to either have the difficult conversations, or they don't know how to or like, like those conditions of safety are not being met in the way people expect them to be met.
It's so
And not
true.
even that they would disagree. It's just not what they were expecting.
It's so true. And so when someone says, can you guarantee that this space will be safe for me? I cannot guarantee that. What I can do is guarantee that I will follow protocol and the conditions that lead to a successful possibility for that, but that each person is responsible for being aware of when their nervous system is activated. And if they're not, they're responsible for removing themselves from the circle until they can recover. And when someone's really pissed off, I tell them, like, honey, I want you back here because it takes 45 minutes for you when you're really angry to to get back to a regulated state. And I don't want you to miss anything. So just do the best you can. But absolutely, in this space, we have to be doing our best, each of us. And I can't be responsible for your nervous system. I don't know how it works. I have one of my teachers is Wendy Palmer and her daughter, Tiffany Palmer. And they have a leadership embodiment training that really helped me. Wendy Palmer is an Aikido master, and I have teachers from many traditions. I'm very thankful. But that particular training was really helpful for me. And Wendy said, the best gift you can give someone else is to get yourself together. And I find that at work, in my marriage, with my, as parenting my, young adult daughter, and then in this work, with in circles, is like, gosh, that's what we all are responsible for, and it's a beautiful gift, because if we can do that, then not only can we share what we can share in a way that feels empowering and healing, but then also others can hear us. because we're sending a signal of safety just through how we are showing up in that circle. And that also can help downregulate other people's nervous systems as well.
Mm-hmm.
Through biomimicry and all the gorgeousness that's out there on that in that area of science. So it's a huge gift to yourself and to others. And the way we do that is to remember that our body's calling the shots and not our heads. So, you know, I'm always like, oh, divine teacher to my body, or, you know, to my family, like here are my greatest teachers. You know, my body's always telling me if I'm over that line or not, you know, and my family's always teaching me if I'm over my boundary line with what I commit to or not, you know, and like, so, and our friends are here too, to teach us, you know, and if we can really listen to how to those people in our lives, I think that gives us a lot more ability to participate in this work and to be kind if we can't. You know, Lila June Johnson calls it carriers of trauma. And, you know, I have people in my life, complex trauma. The war was only part of my parents' trauma. I'll just say that. So the ability to understand and have the compassion that some folks during this lifetime, you know what the miracle is? That they're here, that they're here on this planet, that they're here for this moment, that they made it through their childhood, that they made it through their teen years, that they made it to their adult life, you know, like that's also noble. So, you know, for anyone here that's calling and saying, I can never regulate my nervous system, that's okay. You know, you just need to know that in multi-perspective spaces, it might not be for you. And maybe you share your knowledge a different way. Like for those who can't be regulated for all the good reasons that you're just trying to stay alive, like you can write a statement down. You can send a proxy. You can have someone else read your words. You don't have to be in that circle. And you can ask someone else, you can listen later. You know? So that's just always something that's really important. And I have the privilege of having been alive long enough and having access to resources and a lot of good luck to be able to have enough healing to be able to be present for these circles. But it's not the case in every case. And I still have a lot to learn and to heal from. But when we have the opportunity and we can, you know, how wonderful, but we also honor those who can't.
There's so much appreciation for the many facets that you are honoring, and the many parts of the individual and the collective and our ecology and our ancestors and our lineages that you are finding ways to honor. It's been such a delightful conversation. And just remember, I'm wondering if as we end, I always like to ask the question, what are you remembering?
Right now I'm remembering joy in the songs that I'm learning from the Latvian side of my family. And that's what I'm really excited about for this next chapter is remembering the songs that are the embodiment of joy, and that's our birthright too, is in all of the things that we are overcoming, that we equally balance that with all the amazing joy and the belly laughs and the ways that we lift each other up. So that's today's answer.
I love it. May there, you know, I'm so happy you're learning and relearning and learning more music. And so happy that it's, yeah, me too. Yes. It came up in our first retreat this year, was all around music and song, and it's been a theme ever since. So I feel for all the things that are breaking down and falling apart, there is so much singing, and that singing will carry us.
Yeah, it's a beautiful vision for that. A singing nation, you know, a singing revolution, part 2.
And on and on. Well, thank you so much, Maija. May the song, you know, continue.
Thank you, sir.
Yes.
It's a gift to be in your presence. Thank you for all the work you're doing in the world, all the big and small ways that you show up, and the care you hold for so many, for your commitment to this, for the ways that you walk in this world. I just so appreciate you receiving me today. It's such an honor to be here in your space.
Thank you. Thank you so much for listening to the Remembering and Re-enchanting podcast. If you are enjoying what you are hearing, please subscribe, share, and leave us a review. I am always happy to hear from you, dear listener, to continue finding ways to connect the disconnected and go deeper on your own journey of remembering and re-enchanting with your communities, your organizations, and your families. I invite you to check out our courses and other community offerings via the Sequoia Summon Via website. You can also follow us on Instagram, Facebook, and LinkedIn. Though I must admit I spend much more time working with really amazing people than crafting social media. If you want to work with me one-on-one or bring me to speak at your organization or family office, you can find out more at sarahjelena.com.